Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week we are speaking with Marcus Matawhero Lloyd. Marcus is a speaker, activist, digital evangelist, and member of the Ngā Ariki Kaiputahi tribe. We chat about Indigenous sovereignty in the modern world, his experiences at Standing Rock, and his journey to reconstruct the ancient power site of his ancestors. Quick note before we begin, I caught Marcus between meetings, so we started out on Skype via mobile data, which went as well as you would expect. So then we switched to a mobile phone call. I've done my best to clean up the audio, but that's the reality of catching busy people. On with the show. Marcus, thank you for your time.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Well, let's move right along to traditional question one. Marcus, were you a weird kid?
I still am a weird kid.
Oh, good.
That's my goal in life, is to stay weird and stay a kid, no matter how old I get.
Anything particular jumps to mind? Were you a library kid? Were you something like that?
Yeah, no, very much a reader and an explorer. A lot of ancient histories. We travelled a lot, so never really settled into a place. So new experiences was always important.
So this is moving around New Zealand?
We travelled a little. My father was in the army, so I'm an army brat, and they took us to Fiji and Australia, and as well as here in New Zealand. But I caught the bug and have continued travelling most of my life. I think I've last count was 42 homes in 43 years of living.
Well, yeah, that's definitely continuing being a weird kid, or at least an odd one. So when you say you're looking back at some of those formative experiences you have as a kid, and you start to see that there's clearly some kind of patterning or influence or rearranging of Marcus going on, do any of them in particular stand out?
Yeah, so growing up as an urban Māori, being disconnected from the culture, the language, my family, and what we call our marae, which is our homelands. I didn't have very strong links, but I can't take away from the DNA and the spirit, which is always in there. And so finding, I guess, my attentions were drawn to a lot of spiritual things, but I had some experiences as a young child which were difficult to understand at the time, and my parents weren't too sure of it. We put a lot of it down to being Māori experiences, Māori superstition, and also tohu. Tohu is a Māori word for a sign. So there were moments when things would happen, and then so the easy way to explain them were to say, it's a tohu, it's something to do with the ancestors. We never investigated too deeply at that time, but it would always be on my mind, and it probably has matured a lot more now with an awareness of that, and that's sort of led me to what I'm doing. So experiences with the spirit, experiences with, I guess you'd call them familiar, we call them kaitiaki or guardians that would come and appear. In particular, in my family, the owl or the mawpork is one that's been quite common with me in my life. As a child, having a mawpork show up in my bedroom, no idea how it came in, my parents shooing it out, and then seeing a lot of those at times when death was close to someone in the family. They're pretty common, I guess, for a lot of cultures, but being a city kid, it was just strange and unusual and didn't warrant any real understanding. So here's an example, I guess.
Yeah. What was it like? I mean, were there other things like, dream visitations or weird coincidences, or the stuff that kind of get put into the whole, well, it's funny enough, if you accept them as a reality, you don't necessarily need to, quote unquote, look deeper into them. You don't need to go all X-Files on them if you kind of know that they're a thing that happens.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a commonality and acceptance around dreams, visions, visits by ancestors, signs and seeing signs within Māoridom. And so it just became accepted without any real interpretation of it. The interpretation has come more now, I guess, with these experiences and with the desire to understand better. And that's a part of the process I've been going through, I guess, and it's a consequence of colonisation is the need to go through a decolonisation process to reconnect, to understand, that's been the journey so far.
Well, yeah, I'm just thinking, because you said you lived all over the place growing up. You would have been able to witness sort of other colonial impacts. I mean, was there an awareness, for instance, when you were in Fiji, that there are different lifeways that have been impacted here that are different to the ones that you'd find in New Zealand? Anything like that?
It was pretty comfortable for me with the Fijian culture and the relationships of the way that they would do things. Some of the supernatural, the mystical, the firewalkers, and the same understanding of this otherworldliness that just is pervasive in your day-to-day life. So those were very comfortable for me, but also the influence of colonization and westernization on them. The contrast was great, and it gave me a different perspective than New Zealand culture or a Kiwi culture or a Māori culture. And it helps, I think. It helped me to open my eyes and appreciate and understand more about the differences and the commonalities amongst the tribes. They had a very strong cultural backlash when we were there. We were there prior to it. They had a coup by Colonel Rambuka. So we left 6 months prior to that, and there was a challenge that they were going through related to the land, related to governance, to the history. The Fijian population was a minority in the country. The larger Indian population were the majority, and so there were questions around their democracy and their sovereignty, around the majority decisions might impact their deeper cultural significances. And so those were quite prominent in our thinking as outsiders looking in, but also coming from a heritage which has gone through a similar assimilation, I guess. So that made an impact as well.
Yeah, I've been to Fiji quite a number of times, and my father's families sort of lived in Nauru and New Guinea and so on. And for people who maybe aren't aware, the Fiji Indian population is itself a impact of colonial expansion, because they are by and large the descendants of indentured workers brought over from other parts of the empire. So there's a sort of double hit, which Fiji continues to struggle with, frankly. There's a sort of double hit as to how you maintain democracy as a modern system, but also don't swamp different people's lifeways who are still within Fiji.
That's right, absolutely. And so it was very keen. We were watching how it was how it was working out and how they were dealing with it, and the struggle that they had with it too. So we can appreciate the challenge that they've been going through.
So was this, these are sort of deep thoughts for a young kid, Marcus. Is this a kind of through line through the life? Because when we get on to talk about what you're doing now and what your work involves, which has a lot to do with technology, but technology from an Indigenous empowerment perspective, was it sort of early on that you think I'm really interested in this, even if I don't have the words for it? Was this going to be the mission?
Well, I think the importance of culture was the first sort of important factor in my life and deciding what it is that I was going to sort of lean towards, but also relationships with the divine and with the spiritual. The Indian Diwali festival, for example, made another significant and huge impact on me, having first been exposed to it in Fiji, and seeing the relationship with the gods and the practices and ceremonies. Completely fascinated and enthralled me in their engagement of just their practices, their religious practices, their spiritual practices is a daily thing, and such a contrast of views from what I was used to here in New Zealand to the Hindu culture and experience. So I think that was another moment that I related very well to and very comfortable in all of that environment, not realizing though that there would be more significance to that.
Yeah, it's always the way, isn't it? And it's always how it's funny. The story looks normal, or the story makes sense when you look at it backwards.
Yeah.
Cool. All right.
Yeah.
So, I want to talk because I find this part of it very interesting. We just sort of touched on the use of technology and data sovereignty and that kind of thing when it comes to Indigenous cultures. So, sort of describe what we're talking about here in terms of digital empowerment and data sovereignty, and the kind of how and why of that, Marcus.
Sure. So, what's become more apparent to myself as I've been rediscovering my culture, re-engaging in the culture, the language, the stories, is the lack of access to information. It's also the lack of recorded information, the lack of clear, honest, that's not been influenced information. And so the knowledge itself, the data and the information itself. And I guess a lot of what I'm looking at now is to say, well, how do we keep and capture that information? How do we store it? How do we protect it? How do we make sure it's a living legacy? How do we engage with those stories? With the modern world we live in today, accessing that information, digitizing that information, tagging it, meta-tagging it, and making sure that we can query it and do exciting things with it. All of these questions come to mind because I guess what's underpinned it for me is the struggle to find that information, the struggle to be able to learn what I felt is a big part of my life that's been missing. And that struggle has turned around on me and says, okay, well, how do we make sure that we can make this information available and practical and useful in the world today, and for the many others out there who don't have access. So data sovereignty essentially is collecting, transmitting, storing, and protecting those knowledge systems. And in this context, for me, it's the Indigenous knowledge systems, the mātauranga, we call it, the worldviews, the data of the magic and the mystical of our ancestors.
So it strikes me that your childhood does, in fact, perfectly position you for that, because you had the lived experience of being urban Maori and thus perhaps not grown up soaking in it, and then, moving around to other places and seeing other examples of it. It seems like that, combined with technical skills, is quite a good combination. You seem to be the right person for the job.
There was a process, I guess, that I've had to go through. I've always joked about it, but I've also said that being disconnected from my culture, my language, has been a frustration. But it seems that I thrive on frustration because I've also used that. Because it drives me now to better use the technology we have to understand more. And I remember feeling a lot that if I had known the language and the culture, I may not have been as passionate to use the tools of the world today to better understand and access and share that. And so the great creator understands how best to get to motivate me and maybe that's why I needed to be disconnected, because now it's the search. And the search for meaning and for longing and for understanding of who I am, my heritage and my history. That search comes and brings with it a lot of challenges as well. The need to learn, the need to understand, the need to engage, the hurt that comes from understanding the consequences of colonization. But at the same time, there's still the ability to use the tools of the modern world now to help bring those together. And so that's been the biggest push now, is my sort of role within the IT industry preceded my return to my roots, and I think for an important purpose.
I would say so. I actually, I was just thinking, I have had a fellow Kiwi on the show earlier in the year, Dr. John Reid from Christchurch, and we were talking about animism and how, in some sense, New Zealand leads the world in legal recognition of sort of non-European modes of thought, and it's kind of true. Like, one of the things you just said about using modern technology, like this. In that sense, animism isn't anti-modern, it's anti-modernism. Modernism is a worldview that comes with certain, and I know ultimately very flawed ways of seeing and experiencing the world. Modern is essentially technical complexity. So these things can sit well together. And as you say, if this is what needs to be done, this is what gets done. And on that, I mean, we're sort of talking in abstracts here. Can you give some examples of the sort of projects that fall under this sort of data sovereignty and use of technology?
Yeah, so I guess a better definition of data sovereignty in the context in which we're talking here is, as tribes, we're going through a process now of restoring our culture, restoring our stories, restoring our language, restoring our lands and our heritage and histories. And then that restoration is also requires storage in a digital context. We're also looking at new creative content and media with the cultural aspects to it. So whether that's creating at a point of a browser or taking a photo or some 3D animation or 360 scanning or VR development, that is all starting to enhance our own worldview of our culture and make it more useful in a lot of ways. So data sovereignty is also about the transmission of this information to each other, to our communities, and also to the wider world, because we believe there is value to be had in the restoration of Indigenous knowledge transmitted to the world at large for healing and for benefits. And so data sovereignty then also talks about the protection of that. The digital genomic information, for example, we're working on a project where, with Otago University from Dunedin, they've begun to capture the DNA of our 200 of our tribal members, males, to look at gout as a long-term condition and issue. So now that they're sequencing the genomic structure of individuals and Indigenous individuals, that brings a whole new concept to our mind about what does this mean now that we've got digital versions of ourselves at a genetic level. How do we protect that? How do we look after that? How do we ensure the integrity of the information and the respect that comes with it as well? It's exciting of what we can do, but it also brings up as many questions about securing all of that information. There are things like cultural IP, cultural intellectual property. What does that look like when we create a virtual marae in a cloud space? What are the cultural sort of rules, we call them kawa, the tikanga, the protocols of a virtual marae that's in the Microsoft cloud? And how do we engage with the technology providers so that they can appreciate and understand that information? So really practically, we're also looking at things like Facebook, which to me, Facebook is probably the world's largest archive of Indigenous historical content, photos that family members have uploaded of their ancestors and pictures of their sacred spaces. And by default, it's now the keeper of that knowledge. So data sovereignty is what should they understand about cultural protocols and relationships between cultures and themselves to ensure that that material and that content is treated with the respect and not misused and abused. So it's a pretty big sort of area and exciting. Those specific ones are the genetic the DNA sequencing of ourselves. Now, in a Māori context, if I could use the word mokopuna typically means grandchild. But when you break it down, moko is a record of events, of feats, of deeds, of genealogy. And you can see a moko on the face of an individual in Māori culture. It's called a tā moko. It's when you carve and tattoo your face. Each part of that tattoo holds meaning. It holds a purpose. It holds a record of an event or an authority that you hold. So moko, and then puna is a spring. The spring is like the well of life. And so moko puna in this context is the record of your heritage, which is DNA. It holds the history of your genetic ancestors. So what we're looking at with data sovereignty is what's the comparison between our traditional concepts of those and the modern view of it, and how those work together.
Yeah, it's really cutting edge stuff. I mean, we were talking before I hit the record button about some of my work background in London before I moved back to Australia, and it was dealing with European Union data policy and how the UK deals with it. And in my case, how a company that has a large US business complies with EU law, because they're diametrically opposed in that the US wants inevitably full access to everything, and the EU is to shorten it, is trying to make sure that the individual has some kind of European rights apply to a digital individual as well, in a way that they definitely don't with the sort of American attitude to it. And I was talking to a bunch of lawyers about it who we had as we were working, and one of them, a French woman, she said, if we don't think about this, we'll never get it. Like, this is the one chance we have to do this right. Because if you don't think about it, it is taken from you. And in the case of Indigenous genomic information, that's literally happened, where you've had, native Papua New Guinean DNA has been patented by companies. So it's not even it's a worldwide issue, and in this sense, you're kind of at the bleeding edge of what essentially a person is in the 21st century.
Exactly, that identity, and for us, understanding that my online persona, my online identity, my artificial online being is starting to become self-aware of itself. Maybe it's becoming conscious outside of myself. There's more information about me online, and if you're able to get the systems to bring intelligence and unify that consciousness, what does that mean for me as the physical real being? What does that mean for me as a spiritual being? And how do those bridge together? So, the data sovereignty at an individual personal level is, I think, never been challenged as much as identity is going to challenge us. If you take the sum of my Facebook profile and my Twitter and every website that I've registered to and every survey that I've taken and the metrics and analytics that have been collected by my browsing habits and those things that I have willingly submitted and those things which are taken passively, then you get my school records, and then you get my online citizenship records and my tribal information. And then you bring that all together into some sort of conscious avatar. Now that really opens up the questions around what is identity and who am I? How do I protect who I am? Does that mean that I'm a digital citizen, but mixed up in multiple countries and multiple data centers all over the world? Fascinating stuff. Fascinating for sure.
It is, and it's interesting that digital and physical challenges to indigeneity and identity dovetailed reasonably recently for yourself in the US, where, I mean, if you'd like to tell people about, going and giving a presentation and ending up at Standing Rock.
Yeah, for sure. So there was the World Indigenous Law Conference, which was held in Irvine, California end of last year in October. And I submitted a paper on data sovereignty. Our tribe, in particular here in Ngā Ariki Kaiputahi, have a clause that we're presenting to the government as a part of our treaty settlement process. Treaty settlement is the Treaty of Waitangi, which was a treaty back in 1844 between the English government and the Crown and Māori tribes. Essentially afforded us certain rights and authorities and partnerships between the two peoples. One is a collective of Māori tribes and the Crown and the Queen. So the treaty was established. It afforded various rights and privileges. Over time, there were challenges to that treaty and there were breaches of the treaty, and the consequences have flowed down to us today. We're at a position now, though, where there were breaches by the Crown. We're settling those breaches, and we're full and final settlement is the process in the question. My tribe is currently working through our settlement process, and as a part of that, questions around tino rangatiratanga, or our personal sovereignty, our tribal sovereignty, are presented and discussed. We've presented a clause to include, which is a data sovereignty, which means that all digital information that's tagged with our tribe is sovereign information, and that it's treated as sovereign data at the point of creation, at the point of transmission, and at the point of storage. It has a sovereign right to it, which means that it has its own set of laws as well, and where there'll be national laws that can impact on some digital information, we'll have another set to protect our digital information. And the relationship between the Crown or the government and ourselves will determine how that information is utilised and accessed or protected. So I took this presentation to the World Indigenous Law Conference, where there are Indigenous nations from all over the world there, Australia, New Zealand, and of course North and South America, to name a few. It was awesome. It was great. We got to discuss the impacts of new technologies. How do we deal with the distribution of digital videos of ceremonies, for example? And that was with a Hopi friend of mine who is now addressing that concern, where a lot of their younger children have their phones and are recording sacred dances which were never, ever recorded or shared before. And the pervasiveness of the technology is making a challenge to them, and they're now trying to ask the question, how do you deal with it? So we presented our data sovereignty paper to the law conference, and it was extremely well received, and we've got a lot of relationships. At the time, we took the opportunity to go to North Dakota, because we had been following the Dakota Access Pipeline challenge and battle that had been occurring between the Lakota and Energy Transfer Partners, or Dakota Access Pipeline. We thought, well, we're there. While we're there, if there's a way we can show that we support the protection of sacred spaces, of Indigenous rights, of treaty rights, and the protection of water, then we'll do what we can. So it was a great experience. My family, my parents, my two sisters and myself all went. We hired an RV and we drove for 3 days to get there. And that's an experience all on its own, but I'll save that for another day. And eventually we did. We got to go to Standing Rock, represent and show support from an Indigenous perspective of our tribe, stand side by side on the front line, and consider the importance of what they were standing for, the protection for the rivers, for water, the renewability of energy, and how we need to focus on that, and sovereign treaty rights.
And there were, I was looking at some videos and interviews about this in preparation for our call, and it appears they were particularly happy that it was, not only a New Zealand contingent, but it was a Maori contingent, and it was the Maori flag in the avenue of whatever it's called.
I have to say here, the Avenue of Flags, there were tribal flags from all over America and all over the world that people had either sent or had brought in person. They had the Sami from Sweden that came and presented and showed solidarity and support. They had the Aboriginal contingent that came, I didn't see a New Zealand flag. I didn't see an Australian flag. I didn't see a Union Jack, which was interesting. I don't know why. We took a Māori flag because we're very comfortable and we could represent that. We know the artist who designed the Māori flag, and she gave us her support. But it was interesting by way of absence, the flags that weren't there as much as the flags that were there. And they did appreciate it. I know personally of many New Zealanders who went, not just Māori, but predominantly it was Māori who had attended to show the support that was there. I don't know if we expected what would come and anticipated what would happen, but with the way that the weight of the spirit moved everything, it was meant to be. It was an important place to be and to show that support.
Yeah, I want to elaborate on that piece because Marcus, I think you know why you didn't see a Kiwi and Australian flag there. But I've been thinking about it since. I've been thinking about the significance of Standing Rock, and I wonder I hope it's not the last time, because it was almost an outright victory, but it wasn't. However, you have to ask yourself how many times they're prepared to go through that again. And I wonder what the long-term shadow of Standing Rock is, and just sort of thinking about it in advance of this call. It's probably hugely significant.
Very. It was extremely. The outcome, if we look at it purely on the basis of was the pipeline, did we stop the pipeline? No, we didn't. The pipeline went through. But what have we done? What has been accomplished? The first, I guess, obvious one was the unity of the tribes. For the North Americans, it was something unseen of in living history, and in the awareness was the unity of the tribes to come together to stand as one. That gave a lot of hope. But it was also the spirit and the influence that came to the individuals that were there. And while the particular battle may not have come out the way that people were hoping, what's happened is the spread of awareness, the spread of pride, the openness as well to recognize that, hey, we have Indigenous wisdom and knowledge that now can make a difference, and we're taking back our role in defense of Mother Earth and saying we're ready to stand and we're ready to innovate and we're ready to share the wisdom and the knowledge. There are conditions, and these are the conditions. And so that, to me, was the most meaningful outcome, is the fact that there are thousands and thousands of water protectors that have now spread throughout the world and are bringing a consciousness and an awareness, but also bringing smarts to it as well. The divest movement, going at the root of the money trees, the renewability technologies and energies movement, which is saying, right, we need to get more renewable technologies. We need to make them accessible and available. The water protector movements, which are standing up and saying it's unacceptable that industry or that farming or that anyone continues to treat the earth in this manner. Not that these issues are new, but we now have another layer that's been added to it, which is the cultural, the ceremonial, the prayerful. That amazed me the most when I first got there, was the strong emphasis on prayer and ceremony. I considered, how effective really is prayer going to be? And I wasn't too sure until I began to feel it. And then I saw the impact of the message going around the world. The first hour I was in Standing Rock, I was told about the Rainbow Nation prophecy. I'd love to share that if I can right now.
Sure.
So as I sat with some of the water protectors on the front line, we had a lull between the security forces and the police. They asked me if I'd heard of the Rainbow Nation prophecy. I said, no, I hadn't. And they said, well, it had been foretold by the Cree and by some of the Lakota ancestors that in the last days, when the land would become barren and the water wouldn't be drinkable and there'd be chaos, that Grandmother Spider would send a message out to the Rainbow Nation, and the Rainbow Nation would be people who would become aware and awake because the spirits of the ancestors are returning to the earth into their bodies, and that they would be from all nations and colours, but they would have their one common thing. They have connection to the ancestors, and that they would then, through Grandmother Spider's web, be connected to each other, and that they would be called to a place where they would be required to stand as one. And as I sat there with these wonderful water protectors of the different tribes, they looked me dead in the eye and they says, "This is that prophecy, this is the time, this is the place." And then I spoke, and I've spoken with so many people all over the world as to why have you stood? What is it that has drawn you to this cause? There are so many causes, but why this one? And the most common answer is, I don't know. I just know that I have to be a part of this. And when I take my own personal experience, the calling of the ancestors has become such a very strong message, and it's calling out to us. And so Standing Rock and the Rainbow Nation prophecy have sort of come at that moment of awareness. And I was frustrated when I was learning about my culture and history as to why there wasn't more information from the tohunga, or the what we call the medicine men of Māoridom. Why that information, and is it lost, and is there no way now to restore that back to us? Because if ever the world needed it, now is the time where we could use some of that wisdom. And so lamenting that loss of knowledge has been quite painful. And then I reflect on this prophecy, and I reflect on the promptings and feelings that not just myself, but so many people that I'm talking with now are receiving. And I'm thinking, no, the ancestors are returning now to the earth, and they're coming through us. They're coming either spiritually, they're coming in dreams, they're coming in visions, they're coming in an awareness and an awakening. Now, whether that's through some metaphysical means or a spiritual means or through cell memory, it doesn't matter, because what it is that they're awakening. And with that awakening is coming restoration of that knowledge and that information. And that restoration is also being captured now and shared. And that's the power of Grandmother Spider's web. As soon as they said that, I was like, oh, that's like social media, because social media was the power that connected the tribes of Standing Rock. And social media has been the means to communicate, to get the message out there that water is life, and that we need to stand and protect it, and that we need to bring that wisdom of the past, add it to the technology of today, and make a difference in this world. So it's a little bit about that, the Rainbow Nation prophecy.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's and what you were talking about that towards the end of that story, to do with what I call essentially the re-enchantment of the world, which is the returning of these ways. Marcus, you've actually decided to literally embody this. So well, I guess we'll kind of go spatially out. So when a mutual friend of ours, Charles, was arranging this call, so shout out to the Rune Soup Premium Members, he told me that Wairua has a physical meaning, which is interesting. And if you want to kind of talk about that, because not only what's Wairua, what's its physical meaning, that's a fascinating way of thinking about its non-physical meaning, and then we'll talk about the pa.
Sure. So Wairua, at a very surface level, is spirit, and it's the spiritual connection. It's the Wairua. So Wairua is also what moves and guides our inner being, I guess, the Wairua moved me to go to Standing Rock without knowing why. The Wairua is what's inside of me, and we each have Wairua. If we do a literal breakdown of the two syllables Y and, well, three syllables, Y and Rua. So Y means water and Rua means two, or it also can mean vessel. So if we look at Wairua in the context of two waters, that is a reference to the physical waters of life and the spiritual waters coming together in one, being held in the vessel of the body. And so the body is predominantly water, which is why water is so precious, because we are water. And the water of the spirit are the two that come together and are kept in that vessel. So Rua is the vessel and Rua is two. So the two vessels, or holds the two vessels, the spirit and the body. For myself, in feeling that promptings of the Wairua to restore ancient traditional past of my ancestors that's on the land that we live has been probably one of the more meaningful and significant things that I've ever done, because it's awakened within me new experiences and answers and relationships with the spirit, relationships with the ancestors. So a parsite is an old village. This particular parsite that we have, it's called Te Pākake or Whirikoka. Whirikoka was the ancestor who established the parsite. Whirikoka had a pet seal, and that pet seal's name was Kekino. And he would play with the pet seal, but because we live inland quite away from the ocean, he would have to travel up the river, the seal, and to come and play. Knowing also, though, that because of the distance, if he didn't either travel back at night while it was still dark before the sun rose, that the heat of the sun would exhaust Kekino and that he could die from it. And sadly, that's a part of what our tradition and story tells us, is that he did. He got caught. They were playing, Whirikoka and his pet seal. They fell asleep, woke up, the sun had already risen. And so because of the thick layer of black blubber that the seal has on him, he was exhausted and expired. And then as the sun beat down on the black blubber of Kekino, it began to melt. And all of that blubber melted and seeped into the earth. And for my ancestors, that's how they explained why there's oil underneath our tribal lands. That was their way of, I guess, of explaining fossil fuels, because the only thing that was black and that was like a liquid that they could think of was the seal. Yet, in a very real sense, the history of my ancestors and of Kekino the seal and of his black blubber seeping into the earth and becoming the oil that helped them explain why they saw this black stuff come out of the ground, came to a head with Standing Rock, because here are a tribe of people standing to fight a black snake because of oil that's under the ground and its Indigenous sovereign rights that are being challenged, and its tradition and history that's being put to the test here about what's important and who has a responsibility, a guardianship over that. So those things have become very meaningful, and little would I know that by beginning the rebuild of this parsite, that all these things would link together and connect in such a powerful way, that where there is a black snake in North Dakota, we have one that's here as well, and they're connected to each other. And in the process of rebuilding that parsite has come a connection with the Wairua, a connection with the ancestors. And it's meant taking time to listen and to be still. And I've got no background in rebuilding traditional Māori parsites, so I've had to draw on that connection with the spirits, with the ancestors. And that's how I felt personally, that knowledge being restored. And then with that comes the hope that, this is how it's working. This is how we're able to restore that information back to the world today.
Yeah, it's
sorry. Once I get going, I can't stop. I apologize.
It's so good. For people who, we have a majority American audience, so when we talk about the pa, what what actual components, like what physical components are we talking about that are involved?
So our particular past site is an old tribal village. It's 8 generations ago was the last time that it was inhabited, right at around the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, 1844 period. That's when the world changed for Māori, and I guess the world changed everywhere as the peak of colonisation. So that past site has its last presence where it was lived in at that point, and it has been abandoned and left empty for the last 8 generations. The only visible signs of the past site were what we call pits, and the pits were where the little houses were built into the earth for natural insulation. And so there's half a dozen pits. There is gardening, we call it marakai, there'd be a native garden. There is rua, which is a cave where you store your food, watchtowers, palisade fencing. All of those constitute a traditional past site. Fortification, there are a lot of tribal walls, so there's a great deal of fortification. That was also a part of what would be made into a past site.
And Charles was telling me beforehand there is there's a stellar component to it.
Yeah, so alignments with all things celestial was an important part of Māori history, Māori culture, whether it was ceremonies, whether it was the bringing in of the new seasons, planting, so agriculture, everything had a spiritual connection. For our tribe in particular, our history and traditions talk of the first of our tribe came from the stars, in particular the Pleiades, or Matariki we call it. And so our ancestors are called the Ariki, and there are 4 Ariki who came from the heavens. And then they just came to this planet and inhabited this planet, essentially. And from them we descend. And so for us to look at the stars today is also about getting our bearings in this universe as physical and spiritual beings. Getting the alignments, of course, is important for where we locate certain aspects of the past site, the gardens and the water, the buildings themselves, and whether they're aligned to certain things. So it's all a very significant part. There's still a lot that has to be relearnt about our connection with the stars. For example, the navigating heritage of Polynesia drew heavily on our knowledge of the starry cycles. I don't know if this is interesting, but when one of the first navigators left Rarotonga, he left with Sirius directly overhead at its zenith as a way to be able to guide and look back as he travelled to where he came from at certain times of the year, so he would know how to return, because there was no other way if you were going out into the unknown. So you had to look up in order to find your way back. That's really exciting stuff.
I think so. I think there's quite a bit of broadly Polynesian and specifically Maori stories, and basically stories that have a navigational component to it, which has sort of been there the whole time, but because of the intensity of the last 120 years, they require a little bit of, I guess, bellows breathing to bring them back to life.
Absolutely. For myself, sitting at the past site, before doing anything, I had to sit there for 6 months. I don't know if that was on purpose, but I would just sit there in the evenings and on the weekends and just look at the past site. I don't think you can just restore or rebuild a piece of history without first connecting with the wairua of the place, because the place itself retains a signature of its history. And so some past sites were used for battles, some were used for living, some were transitory ones. Some past sites have very ugly histories to them, with a lot of battles that had occurred and bad things that had occurred. So for myself, I was looking for some guidance. Should we rebuild this past site? And how should I go about that? And so attuning to it was important, attuning to the wairua, and knowing that at a certain time I could get a prompting that would say, just do this over here, or this is the way you should do that, or, this is where you should put the door. Those are very subtle energies and messages that I had to learn, and I'm still learning to understand and connect with. But they're becoming very clear and very strong, and I'm not alone. I know there's so many people that are now connecting with that. I guess for me, this is making it personal, but also making it available. I try to share a lot of this information with my journey and discovery with others, because and then that comes back to the data sovereignty. What should we share? What should we record? And I tell people all the time, take photos. Tell people about what you're learning, what you're feeling, what you're experiencing here. But at the same time, I also take the responsibility to ensure that the information that I have is also available, that it's clear, and that, we're engaging in the conversation about our ancient traditions and ceremonies. Because if I don't engage, if I don't direct that conversation around the traditions of my tribe, then we run the risk of others trying to interpret it and potentially getting it wrong, or unintentionally, misquoting something. So I have to be a part of that conversation, and that's the question or the discussion that I'm having with a lot of natives now is, do we have to overcome our technophobia, and do we have to engage in social media, and do we have to actually be the ones to take the photos and to tell the meaning behind the photos? And I absolutely believe that's important, and we need to do that.
Yeah, you do. I was thinking that it completely flows back to talking about data sovereignty as well. If you're in this process of, and I'm glad that you told us that part about sitting with the past site for so long, because the questions are the same in a way when you're talking about how you quote unquote build a virtual marae and how you quote unquote rebuild a past site. Is it the same past site? Is it a continuation? Am I doing something new? And if I'm doing something new, what is it? And if I'm not, how is it? And I'm not sure if there are easy answers, but if there are difficult answers, I think you're going about it the right way.
It's a fascinating journey, because not only have I restored the old past sites and rebuilt structures as best as possible the traditional way, if there is such a thing. It depends which period of history I'm looking at as to what's traditional, but with some authenticity and integrity, but also recognizing the guidance of their wairua to be relevant to today as well. And then the physical structures there, and we bring in the 360 VR camera and we start to take a digital snapshot of it, and then we take that image and then we put it into the cloud, and then we put the goggles on, and now we're walking through that same past site. So like you said, is it the same past site? Is the spirit of the past site in the physical location? Does it also come into the virtual location? And in my mind, it does, because the spirit of the past site is not, the physics of the spirit is not limited by personal physicality, but at the same time, because the digital environment is easily manipulated, what am I doing there? So, they are really tough and challenging questions, but they're exciting questions. And we have concerns as a tribe and as a Indigenous person, am I breaching tapu, which is, sacredness, by doing this? And so I've had to inwardly ask that question of the ancestors. Is this appropriate? Is this correct? Are we doing things that we shouldn't do? And I've found in some things, maybe we shouldn't be so quick to digitize and throw it out there. And in other things, we really need to share this information. So it's a question mark, all right? But I think the measure I've found is intention and integrity of the intention, and the desire to do what's right, the desire to honour, has to guide the motivations. if the desire is to capitalize and commercialize or to commoditize, then that's not me. Those are the things that don't motivate me, and those are things that concern me. And so that comes back down to integrity. But I also have a great trust and hope and faith in the ancestors and in the Wairua, that it will lead and guide appropriately, but it will also protect as it sees fit. And it will make sure that the right paths are taken now. I do hold to that significantly, and that's what I saw at Standing Rock too, is that there were certain things that everyone felt was appropriate, and there are things that people felt was inappropriate to be doing, and we had to learn to listen.
It's I think you've nailed it with the integrity part, because the question it's a question any creator, just in the sense of making a piece of art, has to deal with, which is like, is this real? Is what I'm doing a real thing? Is it connected? And when you're in a situation of the art by Parasite, it has a whole lot of extra import involved in it. But I think the only way you can make sure it is a connected thing is to say, well, we can stick to as traditional as possible, recognizing the world is different. But the thing that can't change is that relationship with integrity. If you're going to build a whare karakia, like, you have to mean it. You can't just go, oh, well, I think that'll go over there.
Exactly. And the Wairua has its own timeframes, I've found as well, which can be quite inconvenient. I don't have a schedule that suits the timeframes of the Wairua. Sometimes I begin a part of the Parasite, and it's taken 6 months before I get the next step to go and to do this now and to do that now. And then what I have found is that promptings or dreams, I've seen some things that I need to do while I've been awake, and I'll just see it. That's what I need to build there. That's how I need to do it. And I'll get a little piece of it, and then it'll go quiet, and then I'll wait for a few months, and then the next part will come. So, yeah, patience is important in this process. Letting that way to a guide, being receptive, trying not to be too critical, trying not to have too much of my own ego involved in it, which is always a challenge. But yeah, really I have to remind myself, why am I doing this? Because it's because of love. It's aroha. It's the love I have for my ancestors. It's the love I have for the land. It's the heritage and the history. It's the hope that with this wisdom and knowledge, because wisdom and knowledge is not just old, but there are methods that can be applied today from the past that can really make a difference with some of the challenges that we face today. And so if I can be a part of that, then that makes it all meaningful to me and more than worthwhile. That's a great purpose in life.
No question there. Absolutely, it's an incredible one. What's the response been from other iwi? Are there other people around New Zealand embarking on similar Wairua influenced art projects, or if people come to see what you're doing,
I think we're pretty fortunate in that within Māori culture, the Wairua underpins a lot of the motivation for what we do. Parasites, I know of only a couple other parasites that are being restored or have been restored. And I've asked the question, there are thousands of these parasite villages all over the land, while the footprints of them. And I remember asking a lot of our elders, why haven't people restored them? First response is too tapu, it's too sacred. No one wants to go near them because they're too sacred. The other one is, well, we're not sure how to do it. No one's really done it before. The next response is, a lot of the land on which those parasites are now in private ownership, and so we don't have access to them as much as we used to. And the third one is, we're just not sure if this is appropriate for us today. So I had to address each of those within myself and with our elders before going ahead and doing it. But the response has been amazing. the best compliment I get is when other Māori come and a tear drops from their eyes as they see and feel that connection to a part of our history which we've lost, which we've actually disconnected ourselves from. And I think there's a innocence in the fact that the approach that I've taken, it's what we call ngāwari, flexible, humble. There's no intention to build it other than it's just cool because it's my ancestors and because it's me. It's not built for a tourism event. It's not built for some sort of sideshow. It's built because it connects me. And I think with that motivation has brought a lot of support. There's not a single person who's come to visit that has not felt the wairua. And I know it's influencing because now I've had lots of people ring me and say, we'd like to do and rebuild some of ours. Can you help me? I'm like, sure, we can. First of all, you need to spend 6 months going up sitting on the hill overlooking it, asking if it's appropriate to do it first. Once you come back with a yes, then
call me back in 6 months. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, it's interesting. It feels like, well, I certainly hope it's one of it's the first little pebble at the top of the hill for that kind of stuff. And I think it will be. I learned years ago that the formation of crystals, so new molecular compounds, is most difficult the first time it happens, and then for whatever mysterious reasons, and there's no physical explanation for it anywhere else in the world in another lab, if you try to make this crystal, it forms or crystallizes faster. And that sort of says something potentially very important about how reality is structured. And so you get to be the first person to push through this sort of, restoration or re-enchantment of past science, and then the next one will be just that little bit easier, and so on through the restoration.
I hope so. I also felt in the process of building the past site, I got a very strong prompting that people will come from many tribes to visit. At the time, this was maybe 2 years ago when I first began building it, didn't really understand the context of that. Now I do. Now I do. Every month we have another tribe or another Indigenous nation that's visiting with us and spending time here. I don't know if I could have anticipated where all this would lead us to, but my sister, for example, her name is Tāwera Tahuri. Right at this moment, she's sitting in the United Nations presenting with the United Nations Indigenous Peoples Forum the issues affecting us as tribes and also the water issues as an Indigenous representative. And this has only just happened since the restoration of the past site, where she has been invited to participate. She also went to Standing Rock with myself. We have another 40 people coming from 6 different tribes in the next 2 months to come and visit the past site. And there's an appeal that is calling people, and I do think it's because of the social media and because we're sharing this that it's connecting these links of Grandmother Spider and her web joining us together. And if I'm bold enough to say, even this conversation with you is another link with that same wairua, the wairua that you have and that your viewers have. It's universal. We have different flavors to it, and we can bring different aspects to it, but it's a universal process which I just am blown away by, and feel quite privileged to be a part of a time now where this is happening, and we can share that with each other. So
it's amazing, isn't it? It's that's really fantastic and lovely words to almost end on. There's something about having this object, if object's the wrong word, there's something about the past site being physical that is associated with this, that is associated. The fact that it's a portal for Spider into the physical world, because you mentioned that, and then you mentioned your sister in the UN, and it's difficult to explain if these things are associated causally, but they're associated.
absolutely, physicality of this was my first experience, because I had to put my hands in the dirt, and because I had to dig the holes, because I had to feel papatuanuku. Papatuanuku is the Māori word for Mother Earth. And being in the IT industry, I found that I was head in the clouds, surrounded by electronic equipment, so building up the static energy inside of me, and also found it was quite challenging in that environment to feel connected and rooted to anything substantial. The virtual world was this world of make-believe that, I was spending all of my day in. And I found I had to reconnect and discharge that build-up. And so I went and visited one of my aunties who does what we call mirimiri, which is traditional Māori massage. And she asked me what I did. I told her, and she said, that's why. When was the last time you took your socks off and put your feet in the dirt in Papatuanuku? And I says, well, come to think of it, straight out of bed, into socks, into shoes, hardly ever. And she says, that's what you need to do. You need to reconnect with Mother Earth to discharge that build-up. And so the physicality of the pathite has meant that I've really felt and held the dirt, and it's become a great place to discharge, but also to recharge, especially with technology that we live in today. So many of us are carrying phones around and tablets, and we're putting them into our heads that we don't connect to the earth to neutralize those charges. And that's what earthing means, to take that charge into yourself, that it protects us, that we need that protection. And so I absolutely believe the physicality is not just physical, but the physical world is just another aspect of the spiritual world, another frequency anyway. We deal with more frequencies in this world, I think, than, well, actually, maybe it's the same frequencies, we just have a different spin on it now, where it used to be called wairua, and now we call it technology. So it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, Marcus, for people who would like to know more, particularly about the power site, which is incredible, as I said, Charles shared some photos with me in the course of arranging this conversation. But for people who'd like to know more, is there somewhere online that they can go and get a bit more of the backstory, or see some images and see what you got going on?
Yep. I guess the easiest way would be through Facebook. We use Facebook a lot to share the progress of the power site. So you can find me under Marcus.Matawhero, which is Matawhero .Lloyd. Marcus.Matawhero.Lloyd. I don't have a website that you could go to and check out progress, but that's a good starting point.
No, absolutely, and we'll have this linked up in the show notes so people can see people see your amazing work.
I appreciate that. It's there, and it's not in isolation. There is amazing work going on all over the world, but I think it's important. There's a time for us now to bring together the benefits and values that we have in society to make a difference. We live in an age of disruption, and the wisdom of the ancestors is returning to us. The integrity is required to protect and keep that safe, and the tools that are available to share and disseminate that can be used in a positive way. If anything, Standing Rock showed that. It showed how we can unify, send out that message, build the momentum, and that momentum is not getting less, it's just growing, and it's sharing and spreading around the world. So we may not have stopped one pipeline, but we're changing generations, and we're also healing generations of trauma. And we just quickly, if I can, we talked a little bit about the physicality of the pathway being a portal, and being in that portal allows us to connect. Standing Rock was the same. The prayer and ceremonies that occurred created this palpable portal of power that as you entered in, you could feel it. Every good-natured quality within us rose to the surface as we stood for principles of life and of water and of living. And that vision is really what the future holds for us. And so take the tools, take the knowledge we have today, bring the integrity of our ancient past, and then use those to create the world that we all hope and pray for. And we can make that happen now if we unify to do it. So, it's a grandiose vision, but I ain't got much else to do with my days. So why not be engaged in a good cause?
Why not? Yeah, well, I think you've sold us. So, Marcus, thanks again for sharing this story. It is amazing.
Thank you too. I appreciate the time, and it's been a privilege to be able to share that with you all and your viewers and listeners.
Well, data policy, reconstructing ancient sites one has a legitimate connection to, Standing Rock, identity in the modern world, just hook it to my fucking veins already. Be sure to head over to Rune Soup and check out the post page for this episode as well. There's a bunch of photos and videos of the PA and some Standing Rock stuff, as well as a few links to find out more. Speaking of more, subscribe to the show in your favourite podcatcher or on YouTube. Find the show on Facebook and/or find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.